This is listener-sponsored radio for Northern and Central California, KPFA and KPFB in Berkeley, KFCF in Fresno. The program is Sunday Salon, heard every week from 9 to 11 Pacific Time and on the web at kpfa.org. I'm Larry Bensky. Stay tuned. Professor Noam Chomsky joins us this hour for his take on what's going on in the Middle East and beyond. And we do have open phone lines now for your continuing pledges. Please let us hear from you. Have the dedication to call back if the phone's busy, but it won't be if you call right now, 1-800-439-5732, and we thank you very much. He is author of numerous books and articles and has appeared countless times in the media, including here on KPFA and on Sunday Salon. And it's a great pleasure to welcome again Professor Noam Chomsky of MIT to this program. Thank you for joining us, Noam, this morning on this very tragic occasion, unfortunately.
Very glad to be with you.
I don't know if you've been following what's gone on in Lebanon today, the bombing of the apartment building in Qana with the shelter in it. World public opinion has finally seemingly been perhaps irrevocably awakened by this carnage, although it is not probably even unprecedented in this present military conflict. Your thoughts on what constitutes what might be called a tipping point in all of this? This one seems to have finally gotten the attention of the government of Lebanon to the point where they're saying Condoleezza Rice is not welcome. Thousands of people, as we were reporting earlier, are in the streets of Beirut protesting, and other protests are taking place around the world. What does it take, and what's going on here?
Well, I don't know yet what the reaction will be here. So far, I haven't seen any mention, and maybe you've seen it. I haven't seen any mention. I presume it'll have to be reported. It's such a horrible atrocity. I have been getting information directly from Lebanon, where the latest I've heard from friends in Beirut is that there are over 50 people killed and horrors and so on. Qana, of course, is more than has symbolic significance as well. In the preceding Israeli invasion, this is the fifth Israeli invasion. Remember, U.S.-backed invasion. The one before it, 1996, under Shimon Peres, totally without credible pretext, like all of them, was driving hundreds of thousands of people out of their homes, emptying southern Lebanon, killing lots of people, and finally Israel shelled a UN center which was housing refugees in Qana and killed about 100 people, and that caused enough outrage so that Clinton had to order Israel to call it off, and they had to, of course, they follow orders, and they withdrew. Exactly what there was, there were investigations of that by Amnesty International and the UN and others, which concluded that it was a conscious and purposeful bombing. Israel denied it, and it sort of disappeared, but can't quite forget it.
Well, speaking of conscious and purposeful bombings, I don't know if you saw this quotation that leaped out at me. It's from a dispatch by Dahr Jamail, who's been doing so much good reporting from the region for so many years on Interpress service last Tuesday. He was quoting an Israeli Army radio dispatch saying that Army Chief of Staff Dan Halutz, Israeli Army Chief of Staff Dan Halutz, had given the order to the Air Force to destroy 10 multi-story buildings in the Dahr district of Beirut in response to every rocket fired on Haifa.
Yeah, that's correct. In fact, that's been in the Israeli press and elsewhere, and I don't think there's any question about it.
Well, doesn't that recall to you the definition of a war crime, and doesn't it recall to you the exact tactics that the occupying German Nazi army used in France and elsewhere against the resistance?
No, I don't like to make comparisons. Every war crime is different. But yes, it's a war crime. There are plenty of others. I mean, if you look at, this morning's Boston Globe, where I am, there's a tiny little item, about 5 lines, 10 lines maybe, which is a piece of a much longer Associated Press report, which, among other things, says that Doctors Without Borders, a humanitarian organization, is trying to transport humanitarian supplies, but its spokesman said that they have to use taxis because Israel's targeting ambulances. Take another one. Haim Ramon, who's the official of the government, just announced that here I'll quote him for you. Everyone remaining in southern Lebanon will be regarded as a terrorist. He's the justice minister. What we should do in southern Lebanon is employ huge firepower before a ground force goes in. Everyone in southern Lebanon is a terrorist and is connected to Hezbollah. Our great advantage vis-a-vis Hezbollah is our firepower, not in face-to-face combat. I don't have to comment on what that means.
Well, you signed a statement this week along with other distinguished opponents of war and militarism like Tariq Ali and Eduardo Galeano and Harold Pinter and Arundhati Roy and Howard Zinn and a number of others, in which you all said that what Israel's real political aim here is nothing less than the liquidation of the Palestinian nation. And I've been struck as I followed this coverage very closely over the past few weeks in the United States media of the fact that the words Palestine and Palestinian are almost never used in describing anything in Lebanon. They're used in Gaza, where incidentally Israel is also engaged in horrific attacks upon the civilian population, but they're not used at all, very rarely, in talking about Lebanon, although there are 400,000 to 500,000 Palestinian refugees in camps in Lebanon, many of them in the parts of the country that Israel is, as you're talking about, attacking mercilessly from the air. So in order to carry out those attacks on Palestinians, it has to be made to seem, does it not, that there aren't any Palestinians there?
Well, no. Actually, that letter you're referring to, John Berger's letter, didn't even bring up Lebanon. It was written before. It was about Gaza and Palestine, which is why it doesn't mention that there's no mention of Lebanon there. But the phrase about the liquidation of the Palestinians is, in fact, the core issue. The Lebanese know it. In fact, everybody in the Arab and Muslim world knows it. What's going on in Gaza is horrific, as you mentioned, but meanwhile, in the West Bank, and remember, Gaza and the West Bank are a unit. That's agreed by everybody, Israel and the U.S. too. In the West Bank, Israel is carrying out a program called Convergence, which is described in the United States as withdrawal, very politely. In fact, it is withdrawal of a few scattered settlements, but it's a program of annexation. It's annexation of valuable land and the major resources, especially water, and they carefully designed, if you look at a map, in order to cantonize the shrinking territories left to Palestinians, leave them in virtually unviable, almost disconnected enclaves, virtually separated from one another and from whatever corner of Jerusalem is to be left, and imprisoned, because Israel, with U.S. backing, is also taking over the Jordan Valley, which closes them in, of course, controls airspace. Well, if it's all totally illegal in violation of Security Council orders, of the unanimous World Court decision, including the U.S. justice, contrary to what's often said. And it essentially, if pursued, it eliminates any possibility of realization of the long-term international consensus on a two-state settlement that the U.S. and Israel have blocked for 30 years. Now, that's all going on quietly. And in one of the most astonishing public relations triumphs I've ever seen, it's really stunning, this annexation and cantonization program is hailed in the United States and, to an extent, in Europe as withdrawal. I mean, that's an extraordinary propaganda achievement.
Well, talking of maps, there's one in your latest book, Noam Chomsky, Failed States, on page 180, of exactly what you're talking about, the division of that area into what would essentially be unviable and discontiguous territories, which the Palestinians are then supposed to, I guess, issue postage stamps for and claim that they have a state. There's an even more elaborate series of maps in the DVD, Peace Propaganda and the Promised Land, in which you're one of the people interviewed about U.S. media and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where the entire region is being carved up into separate but highly unequal territories where there would be no possibility, would there, of the Palestinians having anything like an economy.
Yeah, that's the point. In fact, that map in my book is from a couple of years ago. It's from an Israeli source, incidentally. But and yes, there are more recent and detailed ones. But remember, it's sort of forgotten here that if Israel takes 1 square inch of the West Bank and Gaza, that's in violation of international law and the World Court here decision. They don't have any right to be. The U.S. and Israel have no right to be there. If you look closely, this is discussed in the book you mentioned, there was 1 week in the past 30 years in which the U.S. and Israel departed from their unilateral rejectionism. That was in January 2001 at Taba. There were negotiations there which came pretty close to a possible settlement, which did allow Israel to carry out annexation, but with balancing, give some balancing of giving up of territories. Didn't get to a conclusion, but it was possibly moving there. Israel called off the negotiations. There are further detailed proposals like the Geneva Accord, accepted by most of the world, dismissed by the United States, rejected by Israel. But there are proposals on the table. The Arab League plan, for example, which is supported by the Palestinians, even supported by Iran, although nobody will report that either, which is a call for normalization of relations between Israel and all the Arab states, including a Palestinian state, on the international border, maybe with some modifications. That's been a possibility for 30 years and remains so, and the only serious, Hamas has indicated support for it too. It's the U.S. and Israel which block it, and takeover of any part of the West Bank is in violation of that, unless within the framework of a balanced agreement.
Can you talk for a second, Noam Chomsky, about the question of the United Nations? Because many people, including some elements in the Bush administration, sometimes are saying, well, the only way out of this is going to be a United Nations force on that border. But the United States continues to veto, including most recently last week, United Nations resolutions that would lead towards a unanimity of opinion as to what should be done there. And in fact, there's a United Nations Security Council special session going on even as we speak in New York, and we're making efforts to try to bring you some or all of that live here on KPFA. And I don't know if we can, but it was a last-minute thing. But the idea of the United States paying some sort of lip service to the United Nations and at the same time exercising its veto whenever the United Nations gets near a solution to this question.
Well, the U.S. attitude toward the United Nations was, for many years in fact, was stated quite accurately by John Bolton, the current ambassador, who made it clear before his appointment that the United States is willing to support the United Nations as long as it does what the U.S. wants. Other than that, it's irrelevant. I mean, yes, that's been the policy for a long time, and he's honest enough to say it blatantly, and that remains true in the present case. In the recent meetings in Rome and in Malaysia, Condoleezza Rice was completely isolated in presenting the U.S. position, rejecting a ceasefire. I mean, just virtually everybody wants it, except the U.S. and Israel. As for what kind of a force there should be in the South, well, you know, that on the border, that's a complicated problem. And for one thing, why should the force be in South Lebanon? Why not in North Israel? I mean, Lebanon hasn't invaded Israel 5 times. It's the other way around. And those invasions have been brutal and vicious. I mean, Israel, again, with U.S. backing, stayed in South Lebanon for 22 years in violation of a Security Council resolution 425. There was no protest here. U.S. supported it. Congress didn't lift a finger about it. During that period, there was an invasion in 78, a huge one in 82, another in 93, another in 96, all harsh and brutal. The 96 ended with Qana, as I mentioned. The U.S. The attitude toward the United Nations has been just as Bolton says. I mean, you can see it from just vetoes. I mean, the most extreme way of violating a Security Council resolution is to veto it. Since the mid-1960s, when the UN became somewhat more representative of world opinion after decolonization, it fell out of control. Since the 1960s, the U.S. is far in the lead in vetoing resolutions on a wide variety of issues. Britain is second, and no one else is even close.
Noam Chomsky, your thoughts, as you write about them, of course, at great length in this book, and we recommend it to our listeners. And in fact, we're going to be offering it as a premium a little later on this hour here in our fund drive, your book, Failed States. Your take on the so-called democracy issue, where democracy is okay unless you vote for Hamas and Hezbollah, in which case democracy is not okay anymore.
These two events happen to be right at the end of just after the book appeared. But what I point out there is that even the most extreme proponents of the scholar activists who support what's called democracy promotion, like Thomas Carothers, who I quote, a neo-Reaganite who's the head of the Carnegie Endowment the division on democracy promotion, and is the most reputable scholar in this area. Even he has to concede that, as he puts it, every administration is schizophrenic. They support democracy if and only if it is consistent with U.S. strategic and economic interests. That's his conclusion, and it's amply demonstrated by history and going on right now. The Hamas and Hezbollah cases are striking examples. Hamas particularly. I mean, in late January, Hamas was elected in a free election. Everyone agrees to that. The United States and Israel instantly announced that they would implement and proceeded to implement harsh punishment of the Palestinian people, because they voted the wrong way. I mean, how much more extreme can you be in your hatred of democracy?
Noam Chomsky, in preparation for this program, we had an announcement on the air here on KPFA asking for people to email their questions, and I want to get to some of those now. Barbara in San Francisco wrote, is there any serious consideration of support in the world community for a one-state solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict?
Support is very close to zero. And the point to recognize is that while one can easily propose such a solution, just as we can propose that everyone should live in peace, it's a long step from proposal to advocacy. Advocacy requires a plan as how to get from here to there. And every plan that I've ever seen begins with a two-state settlement. Then it can conceivably go on from there if hostilities decline and there's more integration and so on. Actually, I've been arguing for that for 40 years. But it has to start somewhere. And if there's an alternative to starting with a two-state settlement, I've yet to hear it.
You talk about 40 years, and you and other distinguished people, and I think back to my old friend and one journalism guru I ever had, I.F. Stone, warned people 40 or 50 years ago that unless something serious was done to address the fact that there were Palestinians and had been Palestinians in the place that is now Israel from time immemorial, and that hundreds of thousands of them had been expelled from their lands, Israel was never going to have peace. A lot of people have said this, people inside Israel, people outside Israel, etc. Why do you suppose it hasn't gained greater resonance and greater response in the world community?
It has enormous response in the world community. It just doesn't have response in the United States. And that goes, I mean, the issue was always there. You're quite right about that. In fact, when I was a teenage Zionist youth leader back in the 1940s, I was part of a group that was opposed to a Jewish state and in favor of a binational settlement. This goes back as far as you can go. But it became salient in 1967. After that, it became really important. Well, the first major event after that was in 1971 when Egypt offered Israel a full peace treaty, exactly in accord with official U.S. policy, if Israel agreed to withdraw from occupied territories, and they were in particular interested in the Egyptian Sinai, where Israel was driving out thousands of peasants and building a Jewish city, Amit, and other settlements. Well, Israel considered the offer, rejected it. Then the U.S. had to make a decision, and it decided, with Kissinger's initiative, to support Israel's rejection of it. Notice what that meant. That meant that Israel and the U.S. had a clear choice, security versus expansion. A peace with Egypt, and Jordan made the same proposal right afterwards, that would have meant the end of interstate conflict and hence security. But they chose expansion, and so it continues. I mean, in 1976, the U.S. vetoed its first Security Council resolution calling for a two-state settlement. It was proposed by the major Arab states, supported by the PLO. Most of the world's in favor. U.S. vetoed it, again in 1980. It goes on like that. I won't run through the details. But yeah, sure, there's an enormous international consensus, has been all along, at least for at least 30 years, on a two-state settlement, roughly on the international border, maybe some minor mutual modifications. And it has been blocked by the United States and Israel, not only in words and in vetoes, but in action. That's what the settlement programs are. That's what convergence is, meaning annexation. It's all efforts to undermine the international consensus on a two-state settlement, which has always been there and still is.
Noam Chomsky, the idea that Lebanon is now, not an idea, the fact that Lebanon has now suffered enormous loss of life and loss of infrastructure. There were more bombings of the roads today that lead to Syria, where people are desperately trying to get out. This country has been basically turned into, in parts of it, into a free fire zone, and in other parts of it into a place where nobody can be sure whether it's safe to go outside at all or even stay inside at all. This kind of thing, without media coverage, would be thought to be the kind of thing that people like you would wring their hands about for years, as you did most notably about East Timor. But this isn't East Timor. This is a country which has extensive media outlets in it. The United States media, to their credit, are in there and producing, in many cases, excellent eyewitness reports about what's going on, and yet it continues to go on. What hope can people have that even with exposure to the worst of the worst, that the world can do something to stop this kind of tragedy?
The world can do very little. It has to be stopped here. And though there is eyewitness coverage of the atrocities, some of them, small section of them, nevertheless the framework is one essentially adopts the U.S.-Israeli position. They adopt the U.S.-Israeli position that it started with capture of soldiers, which is a terrible crime, and therefore the Israeli reaction has to be supported, though maybe it's disproportionate. Well, that's just completely false. In fact, it's demonstrably false. The current upsurge of violence began after June 25th. On June 25th, an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, was captured by Hamas right at the border. And that led to the huge escalation of U.S.-backed Israeli attack on Gaza, supported here, even though it was described, and then the same on July 12th in Lebanon. Well, there's something very crucial that's being virtually suppressed. On June 24th, a day before the capture of Shalit, Israeli forces kidnapped 2 civilians in Gaza, a doctor and his brother, abducted them to Israel, or they've disappeared into the Israeli prison system somewhere. Nobody knows. Well, kidnapping of civilians is a far worse crime than capture of a soldier. That single event, and it's far from the only one, reveals dramatically that the show of outrage over the capture of soldiers is sheer cynical fraud. It shows also that there is no legitimacy to the reaction, and there is no legitimacy to any support for it. Well, I actually reviewed the coverage of this. The media all know it. You can't not know it. It was reported right away in the English language Israeli press, Jerusalem Post and Haaretz English language, essentially giving IDF, Israeli army handouts. And there are some scattered references to it around in the press, but it's sort of downplayed as a couple of sentences, doesn't matter, and so on. Well, that's critically important information. And we can go on. The Lebanese are calling for prisoner exchange, not just Hezbollah. In fact, according to the most recent polls, about 70% of Lebanese support the Hezbollah abductions. About 87% support Hezbollah actions. And they support the abductions as they have been for a long time because they're calling for a prisoner exchange. For years, Israel has been kidnapping, abducting Lebanese, capturing people in the high seas, keeping some of them for long periods as hostages, all with U.S. support. It occasionally gets mentioned, but there's no protest about it. Nobody thinks you should bomb Israel because they're capturing Lebanese, and in fact, they have thousands of Palestinians in jail, most of them without charges or significant charges, and so on. The U.S. and Israel and the U.S. media just don't care about kidnapping.
Well, speaking of the media, there's a DVD that I made reference to before, Peace Propaganda and the Promised Land, in which Noam Chomsky is one of the featured voices, and there are many others. You can get that right now by making a pledge to KPFA's fund drive. Today is a part of the fund drive. I say unfortunately because ordinarily I'd like to get listener phone calls in, Noam Chomsky, and we'll have you back, of course, as we always offer you carte blanche here, but you're a very busy guy and hard to pin down. You're always very generous and willing to be with us at fund drive times, and believe me, we appreciate that. Our phone number here is 1-800-439-5732. The 2 DVD set, Peace Propaganda and the Promised Land, is available for a pledge of $150. Noam Chomsky's new book, Failed States, in which he expostulates at great length with great evidence upon many of the things he's mentioned here today, is available for a premium of $120 to keep listener-sponsored radio alive and to keep Noam Chomsky's voice out there among others, because I think it's safe to say, Noam, that well before you became something of a cottage industry on the left, we had you on this program. I can't even remember the first time I met you and interviewed you, but it goes many, many decades back. And I know that's true on other KPFA, other Pacifica stations as well. So that we have to keep these stations alive economically, and the way we do this is through these periodic fund drives. Today's one of them. We had a very good response our first hour, although we fell a little short of the 10 grand I'd hoped for. We have open phone lines now, folks. They will be crowded in a little while. If you will be generous enough to make a pledge right now, you can get Noam Chomsky's book and/or the DVD, which will give you an enormous amount of evidence, visual and graphic evidence of the phenomenon he's talking about the media. Once again, that toll-free number from wherever you may be is 1-800-439-5732. That's 1-800-439-5732. Call right now. You'll be on and off the phone in 60 seconds, and you'll clear the phones for a little bit later on. Noam Chomsky, another email from a listener with a question, Jim in Berkeley, saying, your analysis of the way the media works in this country seems chillingly accurate, and yet it's my impression you have very little patience with those who've been deceived by that very mechanism you described so well. In regard to the type of consciousness raising which seems to be needed, I'm thinking of remarks, well, this would require starting again from kindergarten. Am I right about your feeling? Do you agree that our primary job is to start from kindergarten?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we are subjected to massive indoctrination. I mean, the United States is not unique in this respect by any means, but it's been refined to a high art here. partly because the country is so free. If you look at the history of all of this, the growth of the huge propaganda industries like the public relations industry was a result of the fact that enough freedom had been won so that people couldn't be controlled by force. And that's why the PR industry took off around the time of the First World War in the freest countries in the world, the United States and Britain. You just couldn't control people by force anymore. We had to control them by control of opinion and attitudes. And yeah, you've got to start dealing with this from infancy. I mean, when I sometimes watch TV with my grandchildren, you know, I mean, from infancy they're subjected to massive propaganda about consumerism, isolation, you know, looking out for yourself, all sorts of things.
Why are your grandchildren being allowed to watch TV, I must ask you?
Well, actually, their parents don't want them to, but it's very hard to stop. If they don't watch it at home, they'll watch it in their friend's house.
This is true.
Yeah, but and it just goes on. I mean, it ends up with what we were talking about before, the shaping and framing of events and attitudes through media commentary, scholarship, and so on. It's it has to be struggled with at every point. That's what fighting for freedom means.
We have a email from a listener here who doesn't sign his or her name, but that's fine. That's part of what email's about. It says that Bush, Blair, and the Israeli government say that most of the problem is Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran, Syria, etc. To me and to most of the people I know, the problem is Zionism. Could you discuss this? Why should there be a Jewish state on Arab land?
Well, you know, we could also ask, why should there be a U.S. state sitting on half of Mexico? The fact is, take any border you like in the world, it was, you can be pretty sure it was established by violence. It had no justification, but it's sort of there. We can argue about, there's an abstract argument that can be carried out about whether there should be a state of Israel. Okay, that's fine. But it's there, it's recognized by everyone in the world. The Arab states recognize it. The Arab League and the PLO and Iran have called for normalization of relations with Israel if it agrees to abandon the occupied territories. I mean, we can have a debate about whether they're right or wrong in doing that, but it just doesn't bear on hideous, horrific current events. Should there be a Jewish state? I don't think so, just like I don't think there should be an Islamic state or a Christian state. And those are all issues to be dealt with, but they're not the immediate issues of trying to reach a resolution to quite horrifying crimes which are going to go on and get worse unless we stop them.
Another question here, and this bears on something I wanted to be sure to mention today, which is the article by James Bamford in the new Rolling Stone magazine. I don't know if you've seen it yet, Noam, called Iran, the Next War. And of course, James Bamford is extraordinarily well informed, and we've talked to him many times here on this program about the United States intelligence establishment and the United States government. He points out that there's a battle going on inside the Bush administration as to whether or not to attack Iran, and for that matter Syria, in various ways, and that this battle is being fought along many lines, one of which is the line of influence of the American Israel Public Affairs AIPAC committee, which we talked about also here the past couple of weeks on this program. He believes that there's a possibility that there's going to be another Ahmed Chalabi coming along as an Iranian in the unsavory, and I would have thought of discredited personage of Manuchar Gobanifar, who goes back to Iran-Contra. But in any case, it's a very interesting and tangled tale that he tells about how the Bush administration is making a decision which may lead to a much more apocalyptic scenario in the Middle East. Yeah,
well, I don't know a thing about the inner workings of the Bush administration, so I can't say anything about that, but I'm sure, you know, I mean, we can tell even from public information that, yes, there's a conflict going on internally. About attacking Syria, I'm very skeptical. I don't think Israel wants that, because if they wanted it, they could do it themselves. the Syrian government has been acting pretty much the way they wanted to. It's been supporting. It has not been doing anything about the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights, which we tend to forget. It's maintaining control of the border. There's no violence there, and they're very much afraid, I think, of what might replace it. The replacement to the current Syrian government, awful as it is, could be an extremist Islamic government, which would, from their point of view, be much worse. Iran is another story. Iran's a powerful state, big, rich, powerful state. It has plenty of oil. It has options. It can turn towards the east, joining up with the China-based Asian Energy Security Grid, Shanghai Cooperation Council, which is seeking to create an independent framework for energy and interaction, independent of the United States. If Iran joins it, that's really serious. The catastrophe that the Bush administration planners have created in Iraq, even to their own interests, means that much against their will, there's a sort of a functioning government, and of course has a Shiite majority, and it has links to Iran. Saudi Arabia, in the regions right adjacent to Iraq and Iran, there happens to be a large Shiite population, probably a majority, which is pressing for some kind of autonomy too, and that happens to be where most of Saudi oil is. I mean, the Bush administration is facing the possibility of what's almost an ultimate nightmare from the point of view of U.S. planners, not just them, a loose Shia alliance, including southern Iraq, northern Saudi Arabia, Iran, which controls most of the world's oil and is independent of the United States and might drift toward the east.
Doesn't seem to be what Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Perle, etc., had in mind as the new American century.
Not quite. But whatever you think about the morality of aggression, or putting all that aside, the sheer incompetence and ignorance and arrogance of these people is astonishing. I mean, the invasion of Iraq should have been one of the easiest military operations in history, and they turned it into one of the worst catastrophes in military history from their own point of view, forgetting what's happening to Iraqis, which is horrible. And because of that, they feel they just must do something about Iran. Furthermore, it goes way back. I mean, the U.S. have been, look, the fact that the Iranians know this. We don't pay any attention to it. But the United States has been torturing Iran without a break for over 50 years. I mean, beginning with the U.S.-British coup, which overthrew the parliamentary government and installed the Shah, brutal tyrant. Support for the Shah, one of the worst human rights violators in the world, all through his career. As soon as they overthrew the Shah in 1979, very quickly the U.S. turned to supporting Saddam Hussein in his aggression against Iraq, which was no joke. Hundreds of thousands of Iranians were killed, and many of them killed with chemical weapons. The U.S. Openly supported Iran. The Reagan administration took Iraq. The Reagan administration in 1982 took Iraq off the list of states supporting terrorism so they could start providing their friend Saddam Hussein with badly needed aid, including means to develop weapons of mass destruction.
Noam Chomsky, I want to remind our listeners that our pledge number is 1-800-439-5732. We're going to have to go into bang, bang, big time pledging soon because we're way behind in our goal here this morning. We've had too many interesting guests and too much vitally important, apocalyptic, you might almost say, material. But we really appreciate those of you who have called and made pledges. Once again, you can get Noam Chomsky's latest book as a premium if you call 1-800-439-5732 and or the 2 DVD set, Peace Propaganda and The Promised Land. That's a $150 pledge, both for $250. And we still have copies of Sir, No Sir, the wonderful DVD just out about the anti-war protest movement back in the 1970s. Our phone number, again, toll-free, 1-800-439-5732, and we need your help as soon as possible, 1-800-439-5732. Noam Chomsky, one of the things that really puzzles me about all of this is the idea that people in the state of Israel, the government of Israel, would not understand that the result of the kind of thing that they're doing in Gaza and the kind of thing that they're now doing in Lebanon is not going to be capitulation, but resistance. I mean, this is a state that was founded by people who belong to organizations like the Irgun and others, and they seem to think that you can bomb and repress and kill and torture and bribe people into submission, but that doesn't work unless you totally exterminate people. If anybody's left, they're going to develop resistance. This is the same fundamental error that the United States did not recognize in Iraq. And now Israel is repeating it again in Gaza and in Lebanon. Are they not?
Well, just on straight tactical grounds, you can debate it. I mean, it's an unfortunate fact, but it's true that if you look over history, violence often works. Bad, but true.
Short-term.
Well, short-term planning doesn't go beyond a decade or two. You can't plan beyond that. And in the short term, the time in which planning can take place, violence often works. Uri Avneri, very fine Israeli commentator, pointed out recently that the chief of staff, Dan Chalutz, who was the head of the Air Force, Avneri describes him as somebody who views the world through a bomb sight. That's correct. It's also true of the Bush administration, Rice, Rumsfeld, Cheney, and the rest of them. If you look at the world through a bomb sight and you've got the bombs, you can believe, and you may even be right, that you can control things by force for the foreseeable future. What happens in the longer term, you can't plan. So just on straight strategic grounds, unfortunately, they could be right.
Noam Chomsky, I want to thank you very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts and your time with us this morning. Noam Chomsky, of course, professor of linguistics at MIT, author of numerous books, most recently and most appropriately, Failed States, published by Metropolitan Books, the subtitle The Abuse of Power and the Assault on Democracy. Thank you for joining us, Noam Chomsky.
Glad to be with you.